So, let's talk about resistance. When you hear that word, what comes to mind? Probably protest signs, big marches, right? A huge, unified crowd demanding change. But what if that picture doesn't really tell the whole story? What if some of the most powerful political acts aren't just about fighting against something, but about crossing lines we didn't even know were there?
Okay, let's start with a really powerful example. Think about this. It's Germany, 2012. A group of asylum seekers are protesting deportation laws. And then they do something that's just startling. They get together and publicly rip up their residence permits. You know, the very documents that define their legal status. Then they mail the pieces to the government. It's an act that isn't just defying the state. It's creating a whole new, undocumented political identity right out in the open.
And then, just a year later, you see a totally different kind of action. Over in Naqab, Palestinian citizens of Israel organize a massive strike day. This is a collective refusal to participate. The goal isn't just to stop the system for a day, but to actually assert a different vision for their community's future. So you've got two very different tactics, but they're both trying to shake up the status quo.
Now, these examples, they feel like classic, powerful resistance, for sure. But they bring us to the big question we're tackling here. Are these huge, visible, organized actions the only way that power gets challenged? Or is there maybe something more creative, more subtle, even more interesting going on just beneath the surface? So, to really get into this, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the classic model, what we're calling the old rules of power. Then, we'll see what happens when protests aren't unified. After that, we're going to discover the hidden power of politics in the everyday. And finally, we'll put all the pieces together to see what a transgressive future could actually look like.
All right, let's jump right into part one. Before we can get to the new, exciting ideas, we have to get a handle on the traditional way academics have thought about resistance for decades. You know, the classic definition is pretty straightforward. Resistance is basically any action that opposes a repressive system or defies authority because of some injustice. So you're probably thinking of big movements like the Bolshevik Revolution or Black Lives Matter. The key idea here is that it's an action taken from a position of being dominated against that domination. Simple enough, right?
But here's where the thinking starts to shift in a really important way. The old, legalistic model on the left, it sees power as just top-down control. The state makes rules, you follow them. But the strategic model on the right, it flips the script. It says power is more like a constant struggle, a two-way street. And this is the key insight. In this view, power doesn't even exist without resistance. Resistance is what gives power its meaning. Otherwise, it's just obedience.
And this all boils down to an idea that scholars call the logic of negativity. All that really means is that in this traditional way of thinking, resistance is always reactive. It gets its entire identity, its whole political meaning, from the thing it's opposing. It's all about being against the existing system.
So we have this neat, tidy model. But what happens when you try to apply it to the messy reality of the modern world? Well, as we're about to see in our second section, the whole thing starts to fracture. Those old rules, they're showing some serious cracks. And wow, this quote from the scholar Carl Death just nails the problem perfectly. He paints this picture of modern protests, jet-setting intellectuals wearing Banksy t-shirts, right next to indigenous activists wielding Sony handycams. Suddenly, that clean, simple binary of one oppressed group versus one powerful enemy, it just completely dissolves. The real world is way too fragmented for a simple us versus them story. So you can see the old model has some pretty serious limits, right? It assumes there's this single unified group fighting back, but modern movements are almost never that simple. It really struggles to make sense of scattered, temporary actions, like the migrant struggles we talked about. It's built on these rigid black and white divides. You're either inside power or outside of it. You're either dissenting or you're collaborating. And maybe most importantly, it just totally misses the politics that are happening in our everyday lives.
Which brings us to section 3. And this is where things get really exciting. Because if the old model is broken, what do we replace it with? Well, scholars in a field called International Political Sociology started coming up with new lenses to see the world differently, to capture all those political forces the old model was listing.
So let's start with a really simple question to frame this first new idea. What if little nothings, those small, almost invisible acts we all do every single day, what if they can actually have huge political power?
The Palestinian concept of sumud is just a perfect example of this. It's this everyday practice of resilience, of just making life livable under the intense pressures of occupation. It's about continuing to farm your land, raise your kids, tell your stories. It's not a protest march, it's not a big speech, But by simply making life possible and staying on the land, it becomes this incredibly profound act of resistance against removal. It shows that resilience itself is a political act.
Okay, so that's one really powerful new lens. But let's push it even further with an even more radical idea. What if we've been thinking about this whole thing all wrong? What if politics isn't actually a two-sided fight at all?
The traditional binary view sees politics as this clean clash between two opposing teams. Think pro-GMO versus anti-GMO. But the multiplicity view says, whoa, hold on, reality is way more like a complex meshwork. It's not just two teams. It's this messy, tangled web of activists, corporations, scientists, laws, even the plants themselves. All these different forces are interacting, but they don't neatly add up to a simple, two-sided conflict.
All right, let's land this plane. In our final section, we're going to see how these new lenses combine to give us a much bigger, more powerful concept that takes us way beyond that old idea of resistance. This is what we can think of as a transgressive future.
And this brings us to the core idea of transgressive politics. It's a much broader, more creative way of seeing things. It helps us see not just the opposition, that being against part, but also all the messy, creative, ongoing ways our political worlds are constantly being made and unmade. Think back to those asylum seekers. With this lens, we see they weren't just resisting deportation. They were transgressing the very idea of a state-defined identity. It's about creation, not just reaction.
And that brings us to our final thought, something for you to take away. Now that you have these new lenses, the power of little nothings and the idea of multiplicity, where do you see these subtle acts of transgression shaping the world around you? What happens when we stop looking only for classic resistance and start seeing the power of transgression everywhere?